All right, I'm going to call us to order. Hello, welcome to the final colloquium of the term and our graduate student colloquium. We regret we won't be hearing from Nick today. We wish her the best and she's feeling ill, but we will be hearing from Junyuan today. Before I introduce Junyuan, I'll remind us about our house rules, especially for those joining us virtually. And please, if you are joining us virtually and you're having tech trouble, do let us know in the chat and we can get that sorted out. Closed captioning is available. And question period will be conducted using the Q&A function. So raise your any questions or comments you have in the Q&A function, and we can bring it up to the speaker in the room. The Department of Linguistics recognizes the University of Michigan's origins on a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi and Wendat. The university continues to exist on the historical territorial land of the Anishinaabe people. Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi are collectively called Anishinaabemowin, and they belong to the Algonquin language family. There are currently 12 recognized Anishinaabe tribes in the state of Michigan and many Anishinaabe people living throughout the state and interacting at the University of Michigan. Before I turn the microphone over to Junyuan and the floor over to Junyuan, I want to introduce him to us. And this is always a great pleasure as an advisor. Thus, advisors know these moments are kind of a perk of the job, right? So Junyuan's in the third year of his PhD here at University of Michigan. He joined us after completing a master's in cognitive neuroscience at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Before that, he completed his undergraduate work at East China Normal in Chinese language and linguistics. Broadly, Junyuan's scholarship is interested in how both biological and artificial neural systems process grammar. In earlier work, including work in his master's degree, he studied the role of low-frequency synchronization in human neural networks in processing syntactic structure. And more recently, he's turned his attention to the nature of those syntactic representations that are manipulated as the brain dynamically creates grammatical structure. We're going to hear about that today. The methods and the theories that we're going to hear about are innovative in multiple fronts. That is to say, Junyuan has developed a research project that identifies a methodological challenge, tackles that challenge, and then delivers on what you get when you tackle that challenge by showing its implications for particular theoretical questions at the intersection of grammar and neuroscience. So yeah, all of that is just stay here, stay and listen. In this project and in other work that Junyuan's developed, one thing that has really been a pleasure for me to collaborate with him on is Junyuan's curiosity and his keenness to explore the implications of some intuition or some leading idea. He takes inspiration from a intellectually diverse set of inputs, articles or ideas from individuals, some of whom might agree, some of whom he might kind of disagree, but takes their ideas seriously. To consider, well, if these ideas are kind of coextensive, what are the implications? How can we start to test the implications of these ideas and start to tease them apart? He has seen success in his work being published. He has a paper in Scientific Reports, and his qualifying research paper, the work we're going to hear about, is currently under review. But you've heard enough from me, so I want to turn the floor over to Junyuan to tell us about decoding the neural dynamics of headed syntactic structure building. Thank you, Junyuan.
Thank you, John. Thanks, John. All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to my colloquium presentation. Today, I'm going to introduce my QRP project titled Decoding the Neural Dynamics of Headed Syntactic Structure Building, in which we ask questions about syntax in the brain using the latest cognitive neuroscience techniques. And let's get started. So this project stemmed from the well-known yet hard-to-test idea that composition underlies the unlimited expressive power of language. As most linguists know, our mind is capable of combining two words into a phrase. Let me get my pointer. Two words into a phrase that can be further used in further computation. For example, here, if we combine an adjective red and a noun boat into a phrase, that phrase is a noun phrase and can enter wherever a noun phrase is required. Indeed, colleagues working on the cognitive neuroscience of language have identified several neural correlates that underlie linguistic structure building. For example, contrasting the phrase red boat with something meaningless and unpronounceable identifies increased activity in the left anterior temporal lobe. A body of work by Professor John Brennan shows that note count derived from rigorously derived syntactic parsing trees explains variance in fMRI data above and beyond left anterior temporal lobe activity. So here's a syntactic tree, and processing this tree localized to those brain areas. In the time and frequency domain, there's a strong proposal that the occurring rate of phrases is tracked by rhythmic brain activity in the frequency domain in both MEG and EEG. So 2 Hertz is the rate at which phrases are presented, and the brain tracked it. So there's some alignment in how we characterize linguistic input and how the brain processes it. However, there's a mismatch that emerges between linguistic theories and neuroscientific data, that linguist theories propose fine-grained structure of phrases. Even this is a fine-grained structure. Forget about the trees. While neuroimaging evidence is correlational and only tells us the presence and absence of a phrase modulates neurosignal. That's it. This leaves the details of the phrase building process underspecified. So there's a question in between. This gap between our linguistic understanding of phrases and neuroscientific data motivated me to further interpret or characterize phrasal representation in neurosignals. Okay. Well, so what do we think is a good or more likely characteristic of phrases that can be tested in neurodata? I focus on endocentricity or headedness here. In plain terms, endocentricity means that phrase shares grammatical property in terms of denoted with part of speech with its head. For example, in this tree, the VP part, like the lowest VP, has different length, but they are all headed by the single verb sailed. The idea of endocentricity is proposed to be fundamental to cognitive theories of structure building. More importantly, for a testable scientific theory, it's a consensus among linguists, among most linguists, no matter what school of thought you're with. And luckily, the current neuroscientific literature actually indirectly suggests that the brain is sensitive to headedness information. For example, when we shuffle headedness in a sequence of phrases, the brain has more difficulty tracking those phrases, meaning that irregularity in headedness information leads to difficulty in processing, although the brain is still able to process any phrases in general. Other neuroimaging studies assume such representations, including work by John and other colleagues. These data points together give us some confidence to design an experiment to test whether phrases are headed in the brain explicitly. So let's do it. How should we phrase our hypothesis then? It's a linguistic notion, and we need to transform it into neuroscientific expressions. A working assumption here we use is that phrasal information should be available at the closing word. What we mean is that as a verb phrase unfolds in time, we encounter a verb. Let's suppose it's a verb adverb VP. We encounter a verb and an adverb, and the brain processes single words and combines them into a higher level representation. Such a phrase, although might be available earlier according to different theories, it must be available by the time it's closed so that we get information about it, right? So at the time it's closed, namely at the adverb, we should be able to read out something about the phrase. Therefore, I would like to redraw the tree as such to indicate that at a specific time, there's like multiple levels of information stacked on top of each other. And this diagram is crucial for later illustrations. So let's think in terms of brain signals or brain activation. We have this tree, and we hypothesize that if the brain builds headed phrases, signal at the closing word, aka the adverb, should contain adverb signal plus VP signal if there is a VP being built. According to such a hypothesis, when the brain processes the VP, it has some activity, it encodes it into neural activity, and it also processes the single word at the moment, which is the adverb. There's activity associated with the adverb, and these two processes will be intermixed to produce a single neural readout that we can probe, right? So this is the case when the brain builds a phrase. What if the brain does not build a phrase? A control case we build is when the two words do not combine. Accordingly, signal at the non-closing word, which is the adverb, should contain adverb signal only when there's no phrase being built. So in this diagram, there's no phrase being built, so there's only single level of information. If you ask why verb adverb do not build a phrase, that's possible in Chinese, and I'll show you later. Yeah, so with nothing encoded in the brain, there's nothing to be read out. And with an adverb, we still have the adverb signal at the moment. So if we combine them together, we only read out the adverb activation. So this signal and the previous signal are two contrasting conditions that we are interested in. Okay, if we take a step back and look at this diagram, I'm splitting things into three parts. So the syntactic tree on the most left part denotes our cognitive representations. And hypothetically, the brain encodes these representations separately. But in the EEG signal, we only read a mixture of neural processes. And there are more than what I drew here that's happening in the brain. But let's be simple. So this is the EEG readout is what we can get. And that's the known. What we want to know is the unknown part, the cognitive representations. And our task is to infer from the observed or known EEG signal the underlying cognitive representations. So are we clear about this logic here? Yeah, we want to go backwards. So what do we need? We don't use ERP. It does not tell us about the underlying representations. Instead, we have a latest new technique called neural decoding. Neural decoding is a way with machine learning to recover the cognitive representations. In this study, we use part of speech because that's most related with grammatical processes. We try to recover part of the speech underlying neural activities. So here is an animation illustrating neural decoding. So what neural decoding does is it takes a neural signal and transforms them back into interpretable linguistic features. For example, when we see a noun on the screen, neural decoding will allow us to know, well, the participant is reading a noun. That's what neural decoding does in general terms. Okay. So in the context of this study, we can use neural decoding to understand whether there is additional VP activation in the intermixed signal when the brain builds a phrase. So let's suppose two conditions. We have two signal elements, segments. One of them is recorded when a verb adverb VP is composed. In the other signal, verb and adverbs are presented, but they don't combine. Okay. If we apply neural decoding, and that will be verb against adverb decoding, so it's trying to tear apart verbs and adverbs in those mixture. What we expect is that in the phrase signal, like the upper gray signal, we expect additional VP activation as inferred by the model. So activation of part of speech, there's increased VP activation in the brain. And there's adverb activation because it's the current word being read. As for the not composed verb adverb signal, we do not expect verb activation, so it's like a flat line, but we still expect some adverb activation. From this plot, you can see that our critical contrast of interest lies in the activation of VP. That's the only thing different here, according to our headed hypothesis. So our hypothesis is thus, if phrases are headed, we expect higher verb activation, like here and here, as returned by a decoder that's trained to distinguish verbs and adverbs. Okay, are we still on the same page now regarding the hypothesis? Great. So now it's finally time to look at our design. My hypothesis is actually twofold. The first part asks a question about verb activation, and the second part talks about what we need, what technique we need to get that. So I will focus on the first half now. We need to manipulate phrase closing, like whether there is a phrase, that's a binary feature, without changing lexical items. And this is possible in Chinese, as I'll show here. So if we look at the two structures below, the one on the left illustrates the plus phrase closing condition. And the first VP closes at word 3. The VP is translated as promptly correct. So the 3 words combine together to form a VP, with correct as the main verb, as the head verb. If we look at the structure on the right, there is only a minor change in the grammatical particle from the to le. And by doing so, we disrupt the early phrase closing because the le particle requires an NP complement. And the NP complement is this whole thing that happened after it, that came after it. So in a way, the VP headed by correct in this structure closes only at a later point. And if we only look at word 3, there is no closed VP. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's structurally different. Okay, therefore, if we look at word 3, we should expect a phrase closing decoding effect that is manifested as increased verb activation because there is something verb-like happening there. In contrast to here, there's nothing happening. Okay. And on top of phrase closing, we also manipulated conceptual association because syntactic composition is often intertwined with semantic composition. So we have 2 conditions, high conceptual association and low conceptual association. In the high association condition, the content words, word 1 and word 3, are semantically close to each other. In this case, it's promptly correct, which sort of makes sense. In the low conceptual association, we just replace word 3 with a word that is not quite close to word 1. For example, here we plug in the word fiercely, like you correct something fiercely, which is not quite compatible with the first word. And the closeness between the 2 words is quantified with word-to-vec cosine distance. Okay. So crossing the 2 factors, we have 4 conditions in total, and we have 60 Chinese sentences for each condition that amounted to 240 items in total. Here's an example list of all 4 conditions in case you're interested, but I'm not gonna go through all sentences now. Yeah. Okay, shall we move on? Yeah. All right, that was our stimuli. And let's turn to the second half of our hypothesis now, which requires a reliable verb-adverb decoder. How do we do that? In general terms, we train a decoder from based on EEG recordings from a later part of the sentence. Once this decoder is trained, we use it to predict or to reveal verb activation in an earlier region, like here. I will introduce the details in a separate slide. So here's a summary of the EEG experiment and the analysis pipeline in case you're interested, but I will emphasize on the next slide more. It's about decoding, so be ready. It's now time to wrap your head around these technical stuff. So here's the decoding pipeline. I will unpack them step by step. Don't panic. It might be the most complicated part of the study. So recall from several slides ago that we split the EEG data into two parts. These are color coded, so follow the color. The blue part is a training area. It's used for model training. And the red part is the prediction area where we encoded our critical manipulation. So how did we do that? The first step in this pipeline is model training, in which we take time slices from verb and adverb recordings and let the model learn the multivariate patterns to distinguish between the two classes. So the model takes one data slice and tells me what part of speech that is. This is the model training part. And once the model is trained, we use that exact model to predict or disentangle verb activation behind our unseen prediction data. So red data is fed to the model, and the model tells us how likely, as in probability terms, how likely that data is a verb. So the model at the last stage returns probability value for verb activation at each step throughout the testing or prediction EEG data, which yields a probabilistic time series that we can test or run our statistics on. Okay. Excuse me. And here are the decoding parameters and the statistical analysis we used. I'm going to pause for like 1 second. Okay, finally, here are our results. Before we look at the verb activation results, we need to evaluate our model because that is a precondition for interpretation. Without a reliable model, we cannot interpret any data. So I have 4 criteria for a reliable decoder. This is first. A reliable decoder performs well on held-out training data, and this can be evaluated with the so-called cross-validation metric. This metric basically examines how good is the model's performance on the training set, although it's some held-out data in the training set. And we can see that the model achieved above chance accuracy in an earlier time window around 300 milliseconds, and from 0.6 to 1 second approximately. So there are 2 time windows with reliable above chance decoding. Oh, and the chance level is 0.5 because we are facing a 2-class decoding problem. It's either one or the other. So chance level is like tossing a coin. Okay. So that's a green light. It passed this test. And the second criterion is a reliable decoder generalizes to unseen data. This is tested with verb recall, which was derived from the prediction region. This metric basically asks how good the model's knowledge is about verbs, only about verbs, because our critical contrast is about verbs. So it's useful to test whether it learned appropriate information about verbs. And we see similar pattern here. The model have above chance verb recall in an earlier around 400 millisecond, and later region around 0.6 to 1 second. Yeah, so that's a green light. And let's look at our third criterion. A reliable decoder is not confounded. What I mean by confounded is confounded by unwanted features. This figure shows the distribution of word level features, including word frequency, commonly known low level feature, and visual feature, which is quantified as character stroke count in those Chinese characters, like how visually complex they are. And the third factor we took is GPT-2 surprisal, which characterizes the linear predictability of a sequence. So the training data, verbs and adverbs are matched in those features. And that's a green light for the model. And our last criteria is that a reliable decoder is better consistent in space and time. This is a confusing figure, and it's called the temporal generalization matrix. Conceptually, it tells us how generalizable is our learned representations. For example, we see this off-diagonal region. It means that the model trained at this time point or in this time window can generalize to these time points. Therefore, we have an off-diagonal region. So you read it like first horizontally and vertically. And the scope topology of our decoder further shows that above chance decoding performance in earlier and late time windows had a similar frontal spatial pattern. In a way, it passed the test. Okay, are we all good with this plot? Good. So far, the model passed all 4 evaluation tests, and we can finally confidently move to the exciting part, finally, about phrasal computation. So just a recap, our hypothesis is that if the brain builds headed verb phrases, we expect higher verb activation at phrase boundary. So what do we see here? This is a critical verb, and this is model prediction results. The y-axis is the probability or the activation level of verb feature. So what we see here is that, can you see it here? Yes. So what we see here is that the presence of a closed phrase increased verb activation. And when there is no phrase at the adverb, the verb activation is lower. Additionally, yeah, so this is the time window for that effect. That's the main effect of phrase closing. Additionally, we did not observe any conceptual effect or an interaction between the 2 factors. Okay. We also performed a control analysis on the sentence initial verb, and we didn't find any effect on verb activation. This is in line with the idea that at the start of the sentence, no phrases are built. Therefore, we expect no phrasal effects. Okay. So taken together, we show that phrasal heads are activated or reactivated at the phrasal boundary, even when the boundary is distant from the head itself. This is something exciting. So the phrase is a VP, but what we are reading is not a verb, it's an adverb, although the verb phrase closes at the adverb. So there's some distance between the actual head and where the head was like composed into a phrase. And the effect timing is pretty late in terms of EEG. It's localized to 600 to 900 milliseconds, which is in line with prior literature about syntactic processing, or P600. I interpret that effect timing in terms of increased syntactic processing effort. Furthermore, this effect is not modulated by conceptual association, a factor that often correlates with syntax. Actually, some studies done by colleagues show that in some neural readout, like ERP, conceptual association had an effect on syntactic components, and they're intertwined. But in this study, because we are targeting at part of speech, which is a more grammatical feature, we did not observe that conceptual association. Okay, so our hypothesis is checked. It's proved. And here comes our discussion. So the first point is that building a phrase involves reactivation of the head constituent, suggesting that the brain forms headed phrasal representations. This is a finding about the underlying cognitive representation. And syntactic phrase structure building involves abstraction in 2 aspects. That's abstraction from the linear order in which words are presented or we see the words, because the verb is activated at adverb, which is presented at the distant time point. And syntactic phrase structure building is abstract from word meaning because we do not observe any conceptual effect. In terms of effect timing, we have a late component indexing syntactic processing load, which is aligned with earlier P600 literature. And methodology-wise, our study used neural decoding to ask questions directly about cognitive representations or computations using the model prediction, like inference method. So that's a step beyond the simple accuracy metric. If you're familiar with neural decoding, most papers use the model accuracy metric, which only asks whether the model knows what is what. But here, we connect models with cognitive hypotheses and to directly test those hypotheses. Yeah. And yeah, that's the end of my presentation. And this project is supported by the Rackham Graduate Student Research Grant and the Linguistics Department Block Grant. Earlier results of this project were presented at the annual meeting of Society of the Neurobiology of Language and the Highlights in Language Sciences Conference. I would like to give my special thanks to my A advisor, Professor John Brennan, my B advisor, Natasha Abner, and Acrisio, who gave me valuable feedback during a syntax course. There is a CES undergrad, Rayming Gao, who helped me implement part of the analysis pipeline. I'm grateful to her. I'm also grateful to members of the Computational Psycholinguistics Lab and the Psycholinguistics discussion group for their feedback on every stage, like literally every stage of this project and this presentation. I thank the department for all its support for my PhD study so far. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Lucy.
Thank you. This is really eye-opening study, I would say. Like, we used to think that this is impossible to like read from the brain signal to kind of like knowing what you're doing. Like, this is a really good step. And the one thing that I was thinking is while reading through the condition that you have, and then because I'm working with Lisa on this project right now, I can't help but thinking about whether there's a difference between subject relative and object relative, because I feel like the overall structure is actually reflecting that. Even if one of them you feel like it is not really subject relative, but it's actually like subject relative. So I don't know whether that syntactic structure might also give a hint.
Let me go back to the list. Here.
Yeah.
Okay. So what kind of construction are you talking about?
So for the first one looks to me more like object relative. And then the second one looks more like subject relative. And then from the data or like the research that we found, like usually object relative is like more difficult compared to subject relative. And I don't know whether that's also part of the thing that can get involved in your analysis.
Yeah, so you're saying the difference can be attributed to the construction difference.
Yeah, and then that will be in line with another thing you talk about is like this is part of the syntactic, processing because you have to go to like a later point where you realize actually, this can be part of the object relative or subject relative. I don't know. This is just my observation of the data.
Right. That's a good point. And I have two replies. First is that unless there's an account saying that the more difficult ORC involves earlier verb activation or stronger verb activation, that's only compatible with our result because we observed stronger activation in the ORC instead of SRC. And second, because our neural readout is actually not general. If you look at the ERP, there is an ERP effect as well. But if you look at the decoding result, it's quite like focused. And I'm not sure if there is a part of speech or head activation difference in terms of those structures. If there, well, only when there is a theoretical implication that's connected to part of speech can we finally attribute this like construction difference to to our findings. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good, great question. Yeah, Ezra.
Thanks. Likewise, this was an incredible report and also incredible study. So thank you for that. My question is just out of curiosity, did you look for a verb signal anywhere else in these sentences, like at the end of the longer verb phrase, or because it's and I mean you could imagine that future projects on this are endless. You could so does it happen on accident, or does it happen on somewhere else in this?
Yeah,
So, yeah.
That's a good question. And quick answer is we didn't.
But you have the data.
Yeah, we have the data. But they don't have the proper triggers, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah, but that is actually one concern regarding our study, because as the let's say head initial phrase goes on, the signal will diminish. And we build this set of stimuli out of like practicality concerns. So it's the third word. It's not the immediate presentation of the head, but it's still possible that we could detect the verb activation, because there is only a intervening grammatical particle, which is not a content verb.
Yeah, I guess then maybe a next step before what I was suggesting is just make a longer verb phrase.
Yeah. That's a very fair point. Thank you. Andrew had a question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll just say again, this was really outstanding. So my question is, so you have this step where you're looking at the categorical features of the words, right? And I think I understand that, but what I'm wondering is, if you used the exact same words, like if you use just the same adverb and the same verb, do you expect to be able to identify that particular verb, that particular adverb?
You mean I decode the item?
Yeah.
That, based on what I read, is possible. But maybe not with adverbs, but there are studies that decoded specific verbs and nouns. Maybe they're more concrete, so they're like more saliently represented. But I think that's possible if we train a good enough decoder with large enough feature data.
So in principle, would it be possible to identify, there's some syntactic theories bear phrase structure, for example, will say that the label of the category is the verb, the lexical verb itself. And so if that's the case, would you expect to be able to detect that particular verb as the label when you do the composition?
I would expect so. If we do an item-wise analysis and repeat the same sentence as a condition multiple times, yeah.
Okay.
I would think along that line too. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Junyuan, for a great talk. I wanted to ask you about the neural signals themselves. Sort of, I don't know whether the machine learning technique is actually pointing that out. What is the nature of the signals there that mark the verb and the adverb, and then what would be the closure? Is there a distinction among them?
Yes,
Okay.
good question. I have a skip slide. Oh, can I show hidden slides without exiting the presentation? Oh, yeah. But I can tell you, there was a late negativity in the plus phrase condition. So when there is a phrase closed, the neural signal has a negative deflection in a time window that's around 700 milliseconds. That's what we found. Yeah. And that's in line with some prior work that tried to localize that with the depth of syntactic structure. It's a late effect and it's negative. Yeah, I hope I could show that figure, but Zoom people will be kicked out of the presentation. Yeah. Does that answer? Is that what you're? Oh, there was a. Thank you, Christian.
Ask a follow-up question.
Yes.
Now it's like sort of out of ignorance. So is there a sense in which the kind of signal that you just described is specifically related to phrasal closure and not more generally associated with syntactic composition in the sense that it's just part of a constituent that involves the verb and the adverb? And I don't know whether maybe I'm missing from the examples whether that would be the case or not. So the adverb either modifies the verb or modifies the noun that follows, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it modifies the verb more directly, you would form a constituent with the verb immediately,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So is there a sense in which the signal is distinct from just a general notion of constituency there? I don't know whether I'm making myself clear.
Did you make a distinction between phrase and constituent? I was a bit confused.
So it's not phrasal closure, it's phrasal composition then, right? That the notion of the adverb is not necessarily closing the verb phrase, it's just composing the verb phrase. It could continue after that. Is that the sense?
I think I use both terms interchangeably in this study. Are you saying like, let's say a verb adverb can go on and that's
Yeah.
composite?
I guess a verb adverb composition, a verb adverb closure is a subset of verb adverb constituency forming. So that you could actually continue after that, maybe not in those specific cases, but that's just sort of, but you already said that it's sort of, you didn't make a distinction between them. So you're actually making reference to a general notion of constituency forming, that is basically forming the VP. It doesn't matter whether that VP could continue after that or not.
Yeah, I think the current data do not talk to your question, but we need a condition where the VP is broken from the beginning, right? Is that what you want? So we need a condition. One condition is when the VP is ongoing and whatever verb we encounter composes the constituency. And the other is like where the brain from the beginning knows this is not a phrase, like a word salad. So there's no composition happening. Then if we look at the adverb, it's neither closed phrase nor composed phrase. And that will be a more appropriate contrast I can imagine. I don't know if aligns with your question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
That clarifies it. Thank you. That's great.
So maybe another way to put Acrisia's question is, would you find that verb activation throughout a longer verb phrase, like on every word of the verb phrase, because it's all part of the verb phrase? But another way to ask the question is, I think your data is consistent with types types of syntax that don't form constituents in the same way, like dependency grammars, for instance. And so could this also be interpreted as, it's this adverb is dependent on the verb. Actually, I always confuse it which one is dependent on which, but like the head associated with this adverb is the verb, and therefore that's why it's getting activated. Would there be a way to tease that apart in a different experiment, I guess?
That's a great question. And our data is compatible with both accounts. But another step to test apart them is by parsing. So a dependency grammar is not stepwise. It's like everything all at once. But with parsing, if we look into the detailed time step of whether at a certain point in time the brain is building something, and then we can tease apart those two accounts. But that requires like two layers of assumptions. First, it's hierarchical tree structure, and then we need a parsing theory that leads to our hypothesis. But yeah, that's a great question, and it's not covered in this study so far.
Yeah, I mean, and if you found, like Acrizia was suggesting, that you do get verb activation throughout a verb phrase, it would be hard to tease that apart too. I mean, and then
Yeah.
there's more phrases within the verb phrase. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would be not quite economical to maintain that activation throughout. Maybe it's like stored. We have some additional frequency analysis on the brain data that's showing there's an increased activity that indices memory retrieval at the closing verb. So it might not be sustained throughout, but at some point it's retrieved out of the memory and like pinned into the structure. That's my interpretation of the current findings. Yeah. The 505. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. These are great questions.
Can we thank our speaker, please? Thank you, Junyuan.
Thank you.